Thank you very much for the Dissertation Award and also the opportunity to be here and to present to this audience my research. So I graduated from the University of British Columbia last year, and I have a PhD in economics. My dissertation consisted of 3 loosely related chapters, all in applied microeconomics, so that's why the title, Essays in Applied Micro. So the first chapter looked at parents' quality time allocation to their children, universal daycare, and child scale formation, and that was the main chapter of the dissertation. In the second chapter, I aimed at measuring the causal impact of academic redshirting, which is the practice of postponing the school entry of an age-eligible but non-school-ready child. And the third, that was joint work with Jeffrey Clemens from UC San Diego and Joshua Gottlieb from UBC, looked at how the Medicare price impacts private physician payments in the US. And that was published last year in the Journal of Health Economics. So given that the third chapter is published and the second is currently under major revisions, I decided in this talk to focus on the first one, which is on universal daycare, child scale formation, and how parents choose how much time they spend with their children. And if time permitting, I can also discuss the other chapters. So in this paper, I find that universal daycare can actually be a successful or effective policy instrument that influences parents' time allocation to their kids. And I also focus on differences across education groups, where the motivation stems from the so-called parental time education gradient puzzle that wonders why higher educated parents are spending more time with their kids, even though the classic Beckerian framework would they should spend less given their higher wage, their higher opportunity cost of non-market activities, and longer working hours. So to illustrate this, I first want to show you the time allocation patterns of working Canadian women who live in 2-parent households and have at least one child below the age of 5, so with small children. So this graph shows that compared to low-educated working Canadian women, high-educated working Canadian women spend on average by 2 hours more per week on work, by almost 2 hours more per week with their child or children, and less on home production and everything else that are not included in this graph. And throughout the talk, high educated denotes having at least some post-secondary studies, so post-secondary and above, including university degree. Low educated denotes having at most a high school degree without any post-secondary studies. And here, the data comes from time use diary data. So respondents have to put each minute of their time into mutually exclusive time use categories that indicates what was the primary focus of their attention in that minute. Work time, for instance, includes everything work-related, so commuting as well. Child time includes basic caring of the child, any educational, recreational activities such as playing with or reading to the child, or anything travel-related, so taking the child to swimming lessons or to daycare also counts as child time. And then home production time includes gardening, maintenance, household chores, cleaning, repairs, and so on. And everything else includes sleep, personal care, hobbies, educational, recreational activities as well for the self, and so on. So this pattern of higher educated parents spending more time with their kids and less on home production and leisure is prevalent. So you see it here is for Canada, but Gurian, Hurst, and Kearney, they show it for the US and 14 other countries, and that it is robust to the type of childcare activity, whether it's like reading to the child or playing with and so on. And this graph suggests that given the positive education gradient we see for child time, but not for home production and leisure time, childcare is best modeled as being distinct from typical home production activities, which has not been the case for the majority of previous literature that treated child human capital as part of the home production public good within the household. So this graph to me suggests that it's better to think about them like separately. And so the broad question I ask, what drives parents' time allocation choices to their children, and why do these differ across education groups? To answer this, I look at parents' responses to a shock to the opportunity cost of their time, where for identification I exploit a drastic daycare price decrease in Quebec in '97 from around $22 to $5 per day. So daycare became extremely cheap due to that actually very famous policy. And I explore the role of differential substitutability between time and market goods in child human capital and home production. And I find that that differential substitutability is actually really helpful to explain and to think about how parents respond to a shock of the opportunity cost of their time, such as a shocked price of daycare. And I also explore time efficiency differences across education groups. So I think about whether that could matter that higher educated parents' time might be differentially efficient in producing child human capital. And this, in the end, turns out to be really helpful to think about why higher educated parents might respond differentially to price shocks. And I will define time efficiency later formally, but for now I would like to ask you to keep in mind that it is related to the marginal product of time investment in child human capital production, and it is not related to the market productivity to the wage. Okay, but I will show you the model formally. So I find these questions extremely interesting. And the motivation stems from the growing importance of parental investments in early childhood. So I mentioned the parental time education gradient puzzle, but these questions are also important to think about whether daycare subsidies or cheap daycare reinforce or crowd out parental investments at home, or whether early childhood policy interventions should be targeted or universal. The Quebec policy was a universal policy. And also there is a lot of literature and growing literature on early childhood skill gaps that suggest that those gaps between higher and lower educated parents' kids open up early and they widen over time, over the child's ages. And that has huge implications on equality of opportunity and the consequences of the birth lottery.
When you say low educational parents, do you mean on average? Are you looking to family structure or social making? So do you consider those type of questions? Or
yeah, so by low educated, so first, so I define low educated as having at most a high school degree. And throughout the talk and throughout this project, I consider the mother's education to determine the household's education. So I consider like a family low educated if the mother has only at most a high school degree. The results I will show you are extremely similar if I consider the father's education determining the household education or the combined education, so the maximum of the two or anything. I'm not looking into assortative mating here. No.
But how about if you have, do you consider single mothers?
No. So it's only 2-parent households in this whole project. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. So for the mechanisms why higher educated parents are spending more time with their kids, so there are many competing mechanisms, and that's why I find this question not only interesting but also challenging. So Gurian, and Kern in their 2008 paper, they list 4 mechanisms. Maybe high educated parents are spending more time with their kids because child human capital is a luxury good, and that's the leading explanation. Or perhaps higher educated parents perceive that market purchased childcare options or daycare options are poor substitutes for their own time. So perhaps the substitution between time and market goods in child human capital production is lower, or is perceived to be lower, for higher educated. Maybe higher educated have a higher preference for child human capital, and it's really the preference channel that is driving this result. Or perhaps their returns to investments is higher in forming child human capital, which is the time efficiency channel. So one of the insights of my paper is that only by looking at cross-sectional choices, there is no way to disentangle these mechanisms. So that's why I look at parents' responses to a shock, to the opportunity cost of their time. And so at the moment, I'm still working on the paper, I'm still working on the model. I received extremely helpful referee reports from the Journal of Political Economy, which encouraged me to think more carefully how I could disentangle these mechanisms more robustly and more formally. So previously, I concentrated on the time efficiency channel. Now I have a more general extended model that provides the framework of disentangling these mechanisms. So I can show you today the extended model. I can show you identification and the estimation equations in the extended model. For the estimation results, I still need more time, but I can show you estimation results from a special case of the extended model. I can show you estimation results for the time efficiency channel, and also for the substitution between time and market goods in child human capital and home production. And for the preference channel, I will show you a restricted model that abstracts from the preference channel and actually calibrates it. So I just want to be upfront that that's where I'm heading, to disentangle all of these mechanisms, and I will show you today the more general model. So the empirical contribution is to use using exogenous daycare price variation. I provide new reduced form results for parents' time allocation. And also a wide range of household expenditures. So I will talk about the policy, which is a very well-studied policy. There are many papers on the Quebec daycare program, but to the best of my knowledge, only a very few looked at time allocation to some extent, and I haven't seen a paper on household expenditures, and none of the papers looked at together time allocation with expenditures on market goods that are needed for producing child human capital and also home production. On the theoretical side, I extend the classic Beckerian model of child scale formation with this differential substitutability between time and market goods in non-market activities. I also introduced this time efficiency differences across education groups. So I allow for higher educated parents' unit of time investments to be differentially efficient in child human capital production. And also I allow for differential preferences for child human capital across education groups. And on the parameter estimation side, so I estimate structural parameters in a semi-structural setting. I will detail that later. So I will show you today parameter estimates for the substitutability, also how time efficiency depends on schooling, and then the preference channel is in progress. And then using the estimated parameters and parents' observed choices and responses, I want to see how universal daycare shapes skill gaps in early childhood. So the main findings are the following. So as daycare price decreases, mothers are more likely to work and they supply more hours on the market. That's another new result. At the same time, households demand more of the typical child market goods, such as daycare or child books, toys, and games. And they also demand more of the typical home production market goods. So for instance, they spend more on hiring domestic help to clean the house or eating out in a restaurant as opposed to preparing food at home. And at the same time, and this is the main reduced form result of the paper, parents, both mothers and fathers, increase the time they focus on their child, and they drastically decrease home production and in some cases leisure time. And if we look at who is responding more, we see that families where the mother has at least some post-secondary studies, those families reallocate their time even more. So I found these reduced form results extremely interesting, especially why do we see this child time increase at the expense of home production, and why do we see that higher educated parents do this even more. So the model gives the following framework to think about this. So as daycare price decreases, the demand for market goods increases because households' potential income increases and market goods become inexpensive relative to time investments. And then if time and market good inputs in home production are substitutable, but they are complementary in child human capital production, then we should indeed see this pattern that parents substitute their time away from activities where it is substitutable with market goods, like in home production, to activities where it is complementary to market goods, child human capital production. And higher educated parents will increase their child time even more if they have large enough time efficiency advantage and large enough preference to outweigh the fact that they also have higher wage and higher opportunity cost of time in non-market activities. And I find suggestive evidence that the preference channel only cannot explain the child responses. So as I told you, that's in the more general modeling framework. So at the moment, I'm still working on the estimation of the relative importance of the preference versus time efficiency channel. But I will show you exactly what do I mean by suggestive evidence. So what I think is going on is essentially these time efficiency and preference channels are strong enough to outweigh the fact that higher educated parents also have higher wage, higher opportunity cost in non-market activities, and that's why we see them to respond like that. So I would like to talk about the institutional background, so the Quebec daycare policy, which, as I said, is a famous one, so I'm sure that many of you know about it. Then talk about the different data sets I'm using. Then about the identification for the reduced form results. So it's a very simple difference in differences framework for the reduced form. Then I show you the model, the parameter estimation for the substitutability parameter between time and market goods, and also the time efficiency channel, how time efficiency depends on schooling. Then I would like to show you some policy simulations. And finally, I want to go back to the reduced form because I found very interesting results when I cut the sample by the propensity of the mother working in the absence of the policy. So I want to see who is driving these time reallocation responses. Is it mothers who are already working 40 hours, using daycare, they are not likely to adjust their labor supply, or is it mothers who are drawn into or drawn back to the labor market by cheap daycare, and whether it's by which one of the mothers are driving the results. That's the interest in the last part. Okay, so about the institutional background. So in '97, the government of Quebec introduced a highly subsidized universal daycare program in which the government granted access to children of, essentially children aged 0 to 4 were eligible for a universal daycare place for an out-of-pocket price of $5 per day, which, so the previous average was like $22, that changed to $5. So it's extremely cheap, I agree. And it was a universal daycare program. It didn't depend on the labor force participation of the parents, means testing, or there were no other entry requirements. So the aim was to enhance mothers' labor force participation, enhance child development, equality of opportunity. So these were the stated goals. And there were not only like quantity changes associated with the program, so number of available daycare places increased by more than 100,000 over 4 years, so it was like a huge influx of available daycare places, but the administrators also tried to increase observable quality inputs, such as curriculum development or parental involvement, or they increased the wage of the daycare teachers, unionization became stronger of daycare teachers, the educational requirements increased, so the fraction of teachers in these daycare centers who had specifically early childhood education diploma, so the fraction had to increase from at least 1/3 to at least 2/3. So the observable quality inputs improved. There was some crowding or queuing at the beginning. So the policy was implemented over 4 years, from 97 to 2000, and we have evidence that in the first year there was queuing, but then so many daycare places became available, so that wasn't an issue at the end of the phase-in. And okay, so who was affected by this big program? Of course, that depends on what people were doing before the program, what daycare modes they were using, and what subsidies they received for that. So the financial incentives changed primarily for the richer, more educated families, because direct daycare subsidies before were available to low-educated poor families, and also a refundable tax credit that depended on family income was available before. After, if you got into a highly subsidized universal daycare spot, you were not eligible for subsidies anymore, and also for provincial tax credits, but you remained eligible for federal deductions. So essentially, because low-educated families, poorer families, were already getting many subsidies before, the financial incentives changed primarily for the richer. But low-income families, we have evidence that they had problems with assessing reliable quality daycare before the policy was implemented. They were more likely to use like non-institutional daycare options, even like family members, so informal care. So they benefited from this huge influx of newly available formal daycare. So I will show you results that, relative to their baseline use, both higher and lower educated families increased their daycare use to the same extent. So they responded differentially in absolute value, but relative to what they were doing before, they increased it on average the same extent. So if you're worried that differential intent to treat results that I will show you are so what are they attributed to, essentially? So because both higher and lower educated families increased daycare use to the same extent, differential intent to treat results can be attributed to differential impact of the policy as opposed to differential uptake of the policy. So it's a well-studied program. There is a lot of evidence on daycare use and mother's labor and father's labor supply, and that is clear that the policy increased maternal labor supply and daycare use. Yes?
Is there research on the differential quality across the centers after the reform has been fully implemented, after the phase was completed? Because if the uptake was same, or the differential uptake was the same for high and low educated parents,
Yeah.
and if high educated parents are already using daycare program, I'm just curious of why it increased even more relative to low income parents, so, or low educated parents. So I'm wondering if high educated parents tended to have access to higher quality daycare centers.
Yeah.
And is there differential funding based on like the location? Just
Yeah. So no, this is a really good question, and unfortunately we don't have very good quality evidence before, but we do have after the policy was implemented. So we cannot look at how they differentially changed for like high and low educated, but for after the policy we do have very good quality evidence by Japel et al. And so they show that there is some difference. So higher educated parents are getting into somewhat higher quality daycare centers, at least measured by education of the daycare teachers, measured by like practices educational practices that they use in the particular daycare center, so there is some education gradient, which is reassuring in the sense that, so if you just see the results that, okay, both higher and lower educated parents increase their daycare uptake, and but then higher educated spend more time at home with the kids, even more time at home, then maybe it's like they are compensating for something that is happening in the daycare. But based on the fact that we see that actually higher educated parents get into better quality daycare, that suggests that this compensation mechanism is less likely to be present. So that's what I can tell you on like differential quality of daycare. Regarding the differential funding, I'm not aware of that there had been differential funding across regions or. So regarding the available evidence, so we know that daycare use and mother's labor supply increases. That is clear and uncontroversial. What is controversial is the second set of results, which shows that, at least on average, child outcomes, parenting practices, and maternal mental health deteriorated after the policy was implemented, and it's still a puzzle why. So while I'm not able to answer completely that question, still out in the air, I can show you some interesting reduced form results on that. At least a subset of high educated mothers who were drawn back and drawn into the labor market, we actually see positive outcomes on mental health and parenting practices, and this shows also positively in their child's development measured in anxiety, hyperactivity, and aggression. So there is a huge heterogeneity in the outcomes, and I think this is like a very interesting area I want to dig deeper later. Okay, so the data sets I'm using are several. So I'm using the NLSCY, which is the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth. So this is a very rich Canadian early childhood data set. For parents' labor force status, I use the labor force survey and also the Canadian census. For parental time use, which is like the main outcome in this paper, so data is coming from the time use diary first, from which I showed you the graph already, and also the Canadian census. So you can see that for the time use diary, the first year is 98, which is really not ideal, so not a clean pre-policy period. On the other hand, the time use diary is a really high quality data set where, as I said, respondents have to put each minute of their time into mutually exclusive time use categories. They have to indicate what was the primary focus of attention. So if the parent is cooking, the child might be around, but if the child is not the primary focus of attention, then that counts as home production and not as child time. So it's always important what is the primary focus of attention. The Canadian census is very helpful because it's a huge data set, and it also asked how many hours last week you spent focusing on your child, how much time you spent on home production, and caring of an older person in the household that I'm not using. And that has data from '96, so a clean pre-policy period. And household expenditures come from the survey of household spending. So for the reduced form, I estimate the simplest difference in differences specification that you can imagine. So in estimation equation 1, yi is the outcome of interest for household I, and the coefficient of interest is alpha 1 on the policy variable, that is an interaction between residing in Quebec and being observed in the post-policy period. I control for C and use on the mother's education in the household, whether it's some college or university. I control for time fixed effects, province fixed effects, and standard set of axes, where in the axis I control for family structure, so the number of children and the age distribution of the children, the age of the mother, and also the partner. Okay, so I try to control for, and it's very important that the policy there is no evidence that the policy impacted fertility, at least until 2008, and my data stops in 2008. So these are not like endogenous controls in the sense. And then so if there are no differential trends in the absence of the policy, which is the main diff in diff identification requirement, then alpha 1 measures essentially the impact of the policy, the intent to treat effect. Essentially, it's the average difference between Quebec and the rest of Canada before and after daycare became cheaper. And then in equation 2, so I want to see whether the policy impact is different for high educated families measured by the mother's education. So I interact the policy variable with this high educated dummy. Again, is captured by the mother's education, and it's really robust to if it was captured by the father's education or the combination of the two. So I also control for education-specific time effects and education-specific province effects. So, of course, the no differential trend in the absence of the policy, we cannot test it, but we can look at pre-trends at least. So in '97, the policy was implemented. It was phased in until 2000. So this shows how maternal employment on the extensive margin evolved in Quebec and the rest of Canada over this time. So you can see that the trends are quite parallel before the policy was implemented on the extensive margin. So this is the fraction of employed mothers. For hours per week, you can see like a convergence before '97, but then the big divergence is clearly happening in '97. And for the fraction of children who are in institutional daycare, so that was targeted by the policy, daycare centers. So there we can see some divergence already in '96, so before the policy was implemented, but the clear divergence is again clearly happening after '97. So now I would like to show you reduced, yes?
Going back to your equation, why is it the case that you are considering interaction between policy and the higher education and not with the whole mechanism? So the coefficients, all the coefficients in equation 1 would be different for the high educational parents?
Yeah, essentially saying why not estimating model 1 differently or separately for high and low educated. Yeah, I did that. It doesn't change the results substantially. It increased imprecision of the coefficient estimates, and I didn't see that it mattered. It really mattered for the policy impact. So the policy impact seems clearly different for most of the outcomes for high and low educated, but not for the controls. But you're absolutely right. That's a very important question. And again, I think it's important that for the time trends and the province fixed effects, those are education specific. So there I essentially have the interaction, just not for the axis. Any other questions? So then I would like to show you many reduced form results. So a general comment on the tables. So in the columns, you can see the outcome. So for instance, in column 1, I show you the reduced form policy impact of cheap daycare on being in institutional care. That was targeted by the policy. So, for instance, that first coefficient in the first column, 0.18, can be interpreted that as a response to the policy. So, cheap daycare induces parents or households on average to increase their institutional daycare use by 18 percentage points, which relative to the baseline mean is they almost doubled their institutional daycare use. So it's a huge policy impact on daycare use, being in institutional care. Again, that's formal daycare centers. There are other modes of daycare, such as care in others' home, which is the second outcome. So there we see a crowding out So that decreased after the policy was implemented, and it decreased more for low-educated parents who were more likely to use care in others' home already before the policy. So if we just consider care in any care, whether it's a daycare center, whether it's care in others' home or in the own home, that also happens, by a licensed or non-licensed daycare provider. So if we just look at the net effect, so care in any care increased by 13 percentage points, which is approximately 27% relative to the baseline mean. And so we see that higher educated parents respond significantly more in absolute value, but relative to their baseline use, because they were already using more daycare, they respond so higher and lower educated families respond to the same extent relatively to their baseline use. So that's why when I say that differential intent to treat results later, so on time use or labor supply, so they can be attributed to differential impact to the policy and not differential uptake of daycare to the policy. Okay. So this is not a new result. Baker, Gruber, Milligan, and others showed this as, also before, but I verified. Also, we see very similar results that are there in the literature on mothers working, so on the extensive margin and on hours. So here, on both margins, we see an increase in labor supply. Actually, the increase in hours comes almost entirely from increasing labor supply on the extensive margin, and higher educated mothers increased their labor supply significantly more, also relative to their baseline labor supply. And there is absolutely no impact on fathers' labor supply, which is also consistent with what the literature found before. So then, table 3 shows table 3 and 4 show the main results on mother's time allocation with the child. So the first table shows in hours per week. So the first outcome, where I say average child time, that is actually measured by the midpoint of the bin respondents had to put themselves into out of 7 bins. So they were asked how many hours last week you spent focusing on your child, and then respondents could put themselves into choosing between 15 and 20 hours with the child. So then this average outcome is measured by the midpoint of the bin respondents put themselves into. And then the second and the third outcome, those are binary variables. So spending between 0 and 15 hours with focusing on the child, which is very little, or spending between 30 and 60 hours, which is a lot, or can be a lot. So what we see is that measured in the census, so the policy impact on mother's child time is 0.9 hours per week, which corresponds to an approximate 2.5% increase. And high educated mothers increase their child time significantly more, approximately 3.5% relative to the previous child time allocation. Just a reminder from the first graph I showed you, so there the average difference between high and low educated mother's time was almost 2 hours, 1.8 hours per week. So then compared to that, this 0.87 coefficient is half. So compared to that difference, this coefficient is large. And so you can see there is a large decrease in spending very little time with the kid, and a large increase in spending a lot of time with the child. Yes?
So the children are spending more time in daycare and spending more time with their mother. So what are they spending less time doing?
Yeah, so previously, and that's also the analog question for the mother. So the mother is now working more, but still spending more time with the kid. So again, I would like to emphasize that this is focused time on the child. So even though mothers were more likely to be at home, children on average were more likely to be at home and not in daycare. a lot of that previous time was not focused time on the child. These results suggest that. So mothers concentrated more on home production. The child might have been around, but was not the primary focus of attention. But now, as mothers are working more, I interpret it as like they really make use of their time at home with their child and not bothering about home production if they can substitute their time out in home production. So if you're in table 4, I want to show you the impacts on the propensity of parental reading. So you might just think that, oh, okay, so what does focus time mean? It's a bit hard to grasp, but then reading to the child is very clear, and it's actually like one of the most important like parental time investment you can do with your child. So there we see like a huge drop in never reading to the child, which is like 3 percentage points, but relative to the baseline mean, it's huge. Like it's like 33% decrease in the propensity of never reading to the child. You can see that reading once per week, the increase in that comes entirely from high educated parents. So there is evidence, or this table shows evidence on like increased reading propensity, which again is the most important parental time, or perhaps one of the most important parental time investments you can do. So why is parental reading so important? There is evidence that, especially if it happens like regularly every night or in an expected way for the child, it really increases like stability at home. It's really a time where the child can expect to be together with the parents. It also increases later literacy skills. It increases emotional development. So that's quite important. So then, what are mothers spending less time on? So it's really home production, and in some cases leisure time. Okay, so for home production we see an average like 2 hours decrease per week in home production time. So here the educational differences are not as clear. So for instance, decreasing home production from between 16 to 30 hours comes entirely from high educated parents. But in general, the educational differences are not as clear. And I think table 6 answers that, which also looks at leisure time, which I see only to decrease for high educated mothers. So what I think is going on, that while high educated mothers maybe just differentially decreased home production time more, they also decreased their leisure time, which enabled them to spend more time with the kid, despite the fact that they also spend more time working. And then on food expenditures and child expenditures, so these are like the typical market goods I'm thinking of. So for instance, eating out in a restaurant, if you do that, you don't need to prepare food at home. So that is something that you can save time and you can do something else. So we see that in general food expenditures increased after the policy was implemented, and there was a big increase eating out in restaurants as well, which in absolute value it's a smaller coefficient than food buying from the store, but because households spend approximately 10% of their budget buying food from the store and 3% buying food from the restaurant, that's why relative to the baseline mean, actually this is a huge increase in eating out in a restaurant. And then the last table shows impacts on child expenditures and domestic help. So domestic help again is something, if you pay someone to clean your house, then again you can save time. We see that daycare expenditures altogether decrease, which is kind of expected if daycare became so cheap. But actually they decrease for high educated families, and that again I think it's because low educated were using before even free, like non-formal daycare. So now they made use of this formal, higher quality daycare, which actually was still very cheap but had some cost. And then we also see that expenditures on games and toys increase, there the educational differences cannot be really precisely estimated. Okay, so now I have these like reduced form results, and I would like to explain these. But also, again, the main cross-sectional question is, why do we see that higher educated parents spend more time with their children and less on home production? Why do we see that as daycare price decreases, parents increase their child time and drastically decrease home production time? And why do we see that higher educated parents reallocate their time even more? So in this model, I present you goods including child human capital and home production goods are produced from time and the general market good. And as Inguri, Hurst, and Kearney, so I make use of their setting. They describe where parents derive utility from child human capital, home production goods, and leisure goods. And I follow Aguiar and Hurst, and I classify the goods, or I allow for differential substitutability between time and market goods in the production of child human capital and home production. Okay, and so again, this substitution is really crucial. This will drive the overall response of how parents respond. And the time efficiency and preference differences drive why higher educated parents respond differentially to price shocks. So this will be a bit formal, but please ask me any questions if something is not clear. So consider a household utility function that is a Cobb-Douglas, and a framework which abstracts from fertility decisions, and households have only one child. Okay, so they derive utility from child human capital K, home production good H, and the leisure good L, according to this Cobb-Douglas. So all of these goods are produced from time T, and a general or a market good X, according to a CES, constant elasticity of substitution production function. So here, so child time, you can think of as like a focused time the parent spends with the child that contributes to child development. Child market good can be thought of as daycare time or child books, toys, and games. Home production time, again, can be time spent on cleaning, household chores. Home production market good can be thought of as hiring someone to do the cleaning. Leisure good is, I agree, it's a bit tricky. In this framework, it comes together from leisure time. So, for instance, the time I will take on Thursday to go to a ballet show, but I also had to buy the ballet ticket. So from these, I form essentially my leisure good, and I derive utility from that. So the crucial here is that these production functions. So first, it's a CES. So time and market good inputs, so they are substitutable to some extent. And the rho, the substitution parameter, is really driving to what extent they are substitutable. Okay, so rho negative means they are inputs are complementary. Rho positive and less than 1, so they can be 1, that means they are substitutable, with the Leontiev and the perfect substitution being the limiting cases. And it's really important that I allow for this rho to be different for the different goods. Okay, so for child time, it's different, for home production time is different. So that's one crucial thing. The second is this time efficiency, which is denoted by gamma, and so you can see it multiplies the time input. So for child human capital, this gamma k is the time efficiency parameter, which I assume depends on schooling S and a good specific productivity error. So in case of child human capital production, I think of it as innate parental ability you are born with, or you discover when your child is born, that is orthogonal to schooling. Okay, and this multiplies the time input. So essentially, if time efficiency is higher, then the marginal product of time investment is higher. And then there are also differences. So again, this is like the general model where I allow for preferences to differ by education. So the betas, the utility weights, essentially, they also depend on schooling and depend on the unobserved heterogeneity in preferences. Then households, they maximize their utility subject to constraints. So they choose X market goods for each of the goods, and also their time that they allocate to working, child time, home production, and leisure, subject to the time constraints for both the mother and the father. Again, so they divide time into work time, child time, home production, and leisure time. And they also have a budget constraints, so they spend money on the market goods. So B denotes everything else than daycare, so like child books. So they buy the books, they buy the home production market good, also for leisure. Then while the mother is working, they use daycare with the price of M. Okay, so this is crucial that I assume that while the mother is working, they use daycare. And they use a nanny with the price of N while they are enjoying leisure. Okay, and then they have labor income on the right-hand side. Okay, so I will come back on like what is crucial assumption here. But then, so the structural parameters, just to be clear, again are the rows, the substitution parameters, different for child time and home production. And so the data that I will parameterize how time efficiency depends on schooling, and then delta will denote that. For preferences, again, I will parameterize how preferences depend on schooling, and then that phi will show how preferences depend on schooling. Okay, so these are the three sets of structural parameters I'm interested in, and today I will show you estimates for the rows and the deltas. Okay, so then I rearrange the budget constraint from the mother's perspective. So alpha is the share of the market goods that is not daycare, so the books, toys, and games. Theta k is the share of the mother's time within the household time for child human capital production. So theta is a share of the mother's time within the household. And then CKs are the opportunity costs, which are really the important elements here. So what is the opportunity cost of a mother to spend time with the kid? It is her wage she would get on the market minus the daycare cost. It's the same for home production time. The leisure is more expensive by the cost of the nanny. And so here, it is important that I assume that the parents are using daycare while the mother is working. Actually, I could assume that they are, so the daycare use depends on both parents' labor supply. I have that version. It just complicates things. The important thing is that to some extent daycare use depends on labor supply decisions, and that's how essentially the daycare price M is linked to the wage, which will be really important, and you will see where exactly in the optimal choice is. Okay, so I assume fathers to work full-time. The daycare price doesn't impact their labor supply. That is, I agree, it can be viewed as a strong assumption, but also it is really in the data. Fathers just don't respond at all, and that's very robust. So essentially I abstract from bargaining within the household, which again might seem restrictive, but also this model is not about bargaining between mothers and fathers, especially because both mothers and fathers seem to respond in the same direction to a daycare price change both in child time allocation and home production, except that fathers just don't respond with their labor time. So I assume that essentially the child market good comes together from child books, toys, and games B and daycare time D, according to a Cobb-Douglas. And I also assume that households' child time, TK, is coming together from both the mother's and the father's time with equal weights. It's essentially, this is how I abstract from bargaining, but I allow for the within household time reallocation depending on the relative opportunity costs of mothers and fathers. So I think in that extent it is not that restrictive, and it really keeps the model simple and tractable to be able to go further. And then I have the Marshallian demands, or the optimal choices for child goods and child time, similarly to home production time and home production goods, and leisure as well, but here the focus is on the children's goods and time. So here I just want to highlight a very important thing, is that, so you can see that this phi, which is depending on the wage minus the daycare price, W minus M, but also in the power you have the substitution parameters. Again, if it's positive, then inputs are substitutable, negative means inputs are complementary. So you can see that here there is like an interaction between the two. So if I do comparative statics, if I look at how the price of daycare changes and how parents respond to that, it really depends on the sign of the substitution parameters. And that's how I can get differential responses to child time versus home production time, because the signs of the substitution parameters are different. In home production, it seems that inputs are substitutable. In child human capital production, they are complementary. Okay, so that's why it is important that I assume that daycare use to some extent is linked to labor supply. If it was just a lump sum expenditure, then I wouldn't get this interaction between daycare price and the substitution parameter. Okay. Okay, so then what does the model say? And I'm just mindful of time. So the model says that if we fix time efficiency and also preferences, no, actually we just fix time efficiency, then higher wage and higher preference parents, so parents who have higher preference for child human capital or home production goods, they will buy more of any of the market goods because they became relatively less expensive, and also households' potential income increased due to cheap daycare. Okay, so there is like an increase in the demand for any of the market goods. That's like the first thing that is happening. And then here comes the complementarity, substitutability, importance and difference. So if there is complementarity between time and market goods in child human capital production, then parents will also spend more time with their kids. And if there is substitutability in home production, they will spend less time on home production. Okay, and they increase the time spent with their kids despite the fact, actually, that they have a time efficiency advantage. So for that, we don't even need that channel to explain this increase. It really depends on this complementarity between child time and child market goods to produce human capital. So then what does happen when there is a decrease in the price of daycare? So then similarly, so demand for any of the goods increase because of the same mechanism. Here again, complementarity and substitutability matters. So if there's complementarity in child human capital production, then child time will increase at the expense of their home production time. And then, so if higher educated parents have a large enough time efficiency advantage and also a large enough preference for child human capital, then they will increase their child time despite the fact that they also have higher wage. Okay, and I told you I have suggestive evidence that the preference channel cannot itself explain the child time increase, so I just would like to go back to the optimal choices, the Marshallian demands, and just observe that it is log separable in the utility parameter beta, which is coming from the Cobb-Douglas utility specification. So this implies that essentially, if I look at how the log of the child time responds to a daycare price change, the preference channel can be separated out. And without the time efficiency channel, the remaining part will depend on only on the daycare price. So if I look at how daycare price changes, actually the model predicts that parents should spend less time with their kids, which is not consistent with the data. So essentially, time efficiency is needed to explain this pattern why parents increase their time spent with their kids. The preference channel cannot itself explain that. And I'm upfront about it that this is coming from the Cobb-Douglas utility specification, this log separability, but I also think that it is a very general utility specification for the parents. I experimented with many other utility specifications, and things just get more complicated and more restrictive actually if I don't assume Cobb-Douglas but something more special. Okay, so at the moment I just would like to argue and convince you that time efficiency channel is important besides the preferences. That's why we can explain why parents, higher educated parents increase their child time even more. But as I said, it's in progress to estimate the two channels formally and separately. Okay, and then the question is, how do I estimate the structural parameters in this setup? So I take first the optimal choices for child goods and child time. And then I parameterize the time efficiency. So you remember that depends on schooling S, so years of schooling, and the good specific productivity error, and the delta in the power. If that's positive, then time efficiency depends positively on schooling. If negative, then it depends negatively on schooling. And with that, I can transform essentially the optimal choices in 5 into a regression, where on the left-hand side, I have the ratio, the log of the ratio of the optimal choices. And on the right-hand side, I have log schooling, this like really nonlinear function of the wage and the daycare price. And here in the error, I have that productivity error, essential parental ability. Okay, so this is the regression, and just observe that the coefficients in this regression are nonlinear functions of the structural parameters I'm after. Okay, so then if I can identify these regression coefficients, then I can back out the structural parameters from that. But then there is a concern that the net wage, or that nonlinear function of the wage, is related to parental ability through some general ability, even conditional on schooling. So I instrument that endogenous variable, so that net wage, with the policy change. Okay, so again, I use the Quebec daycare program to identify by arguing that the policy is not related to innate parental ability. So you can see that the identifying variation is the same in both the reduced form as in this semi-structural setting, but while the reduced form only tells me the signs of the parameters, so whether rho is negative or positive, complementarity or substitutability, here I can also see the magnitudes of the coefficients. And but of course I had to impose like structure, which is really this parameterization. Okay, so that's like the additional thing I had to add to arrive at this regression equation. So this is estimated by 2 SLS, 2-stage least squares, and then so the coefficients can be estimated, and rho and delta can be backed out from that. Okay, so that's for the substitution parameter rho and the coefficient on schooling in time efficiency. Yes?
Is schooling also endogenous?
No, so that's like an assumption, identifying assumption actually crucial, that schooling is orthogonal to this innate parental ability. yeah, I had it on where I introduced the model, and thanks for asking to say it again. Yeah, that is an assumption I have to make to be able to identify. And so that, for instance, means that in this model, for the identification to work, I have to abstract from higher educated parents being able to improve in their parenting abilities. Some people think that that is a realistic thing. There are differences across parents in how much they would like to improve in their parenting skills. If that's related to education, then that might be a concern here, but I abstract from that. Okay. Okay, so and then the coefficient on schooling in the preference. So again, I start from the optimal choices. I do this parameterization, very similar. Preference depends on schooling, and this unobserved heterogeneity, again, orthogonal to schooling. And then just starting from the optimal time use, T star, I can arrive again at a regression where it's really this phi k that I'm interested in, how preference depends on schooling. So observe that on the left-hand side of this regression, everything I see in the data. So T star is an optimal time use I see in the data. Then income, wage, daycare price, and then the phi is more complicated, but I also observe that in the data. So essentially, I just have to calculate this or construct it for everyone in the data set, and essentially look at the relationship of that object and log schooling to get the parameter on log schooling. So this is how the preference will be identified. It's in progress. So that's the general approach I take. I take the optimal demands from the model, do a parameterization. So this is for the preference, this is for the time efficiency, and then arrive at the regression where the identification assumption or the identifying variation is again coming from the policy. And the model is actually also very helpful to sign the bias if I didn't do a 2SLS here, but an OLS estimation. So I just find this like a helpful framework to work within to identify structural parameters. So this is in progress. I can show you parameter estimates from a restrictive approach, which abstracts from heterogeneity in preferences. Okay, so the only heterogeneity in this model is coming from the time efficiency, and of course, so wages also differ by education. So then I start from the optimal time use. I do this parameterization, so the logic is very similar. This is just a special case of the general model I showed you before. And again, I can arrive at a regression equation where beta k on the left-hand side is assumed to be constant and not varying. And I calibrate that beta, but I don't introduce any heterogeneity in there. So that's like the previous version of the model, but I can show you the estimation results. And then the same thing, I'm worried that this object is endogenous. I instrument it with the policy change in a 2SLS framework, and then I can arrive at the estimation results for child time. So rho again is the substitution parameter between time and market goods in child human capital production. So I see that the estimation result is minus 0.4, meaning time and market goods are moderately complementary in child human capital production. And delta is positive and actually significant, so I'm not showing you the delta meta standard errors, but it's significant, showing that high educated parents have a time efficiency in child human capital production. I do the same for home production, so there I get a rho, so substitution parameter 0.67, implying like substantial substitutability between time and market goods in home production. Actually the data is significantly positive, meaning that high educated parents actually have a time efficiency advantage in home production as well. Okay. And then, so I want to see, again, this framework abstracts from preference differences. But I want to see how much, still in this simple framework, how much time efficiency matters. So I just take a very simplified version of our lives, where I assume that child human capital is produced according to this CES production function. Only from child time, the parent spends with the child, and daycare time, the child spends at daycare. Okay, so these are the only two inputs in child human capital production. And I use the estimated structural parameters, and also, on average, what I see in the data, how much parents are spending with their children, how much children are spending in daycare, separately for high and low educated parents, and separately across ages. And so what I see is that even without any policy implemented, there is already like a gap. So high educated parents' children have a higher child human capital already at very young ages. And still, suppose there is like no policy implemented, I just look at how in the rest of Canada time investments evolve, daycare time evolves. I see that this gap across ages actually becomes wider, which is approximately by 8%, which is consistent with the literature that shows these widening skill gaps. So this widening skill gap is coming from two things here in this model. So first, so it depends on the concavity of the production function for sure, but it also comes from higher educated parents are having a time efficiency advantage, so their unit of time investments produces a higher human capital, and also they actually increase their inputs over this time, even without the policy. But then, what does it do if we implement this highly subsidized universal daycare program at age 2.5? So then I feed in like parents' responses, again I see in the data for low and high educated parents, and also the estimated structure parameters, and again I graph the gap. So here, so relative to the case when there was like no policy, like the gap increased by like 30%, and this again comes from two factors. So first, high educated parents increase their time more, so they increase the inputs more, but they also have a time efficiency advantage. So then what happens if I take away their time efficiency advantage, which in this model means that they have less schooling actually? So then the gap shrinks by 50%. What if low educated parents didn't have a time efficiency disadvantage, meaning having more schooling in this model? Then again the gap shrinks, but to a smaller extent. So to me this is just a very simple example of I wanted to quantify the importance of these time efficiency channels and how does it matter for the gap. And to me, these results suggest that it's quantitatively important, and it is important to think about this channel. Okay, but again, if I will have estimated also the preference channel, then I can essentially shut down each of the channels and quantify the relative importance. So this exercise can be a bit more elaborate and sophisticated. Okay, but that's the idea. To quantify how much these channels matter and how much they matter relative to each other in the future. Okay, so the model can be extended by introducing, so you asked about daycare quality. Also, besides daycare quality, the quality of maternal time can be introduced in the model, because so far, I mean, I presented you a model where child human capital is produced from time, and mostly time, but also the time of the parents, but daycare time as well. Both of them increase. This model unambiguously predicts that human capital should increase after the policy. Still, we see on average these deteriorating outcomes. That is really puzzling. So I think one way to look more into that is to introduce these quality measures. So I told you that the average daycare quality didn't deteriorate, so we don't have evidence that it did. But it can be interesting to incorporate it in the model and to see how that matters. Also, I think it can be really interesting to incorporate the quality of maternal time. I mean, these are mothers who went into the labor market or went back, or they increased their labor supply. That has to have an effect on how they feel, how they spend time with the child at home. So I think that is definitely in my plans to incorporate that. I can also introduce birth weight, for instance, allowing the time efficiency to depend also on birth weight, because you might think that maybe it's not time efficiency per se of high educated parents that matters, but high educated parents tend to have higher birth weight kids. Maybe for them the returns to investments are different, so it's important to consider or capture initial child human capital to some extent. So it is possible in the model, and that's also in progress. So, and then the last thing I would like to present you is again going back to reduced form results. But essentially I'm interested whether these child time increases are driven by mothers who were already likely to work, or by mothers who were induced to work by the policy. So why is this interesting or important? So consider a mother who is already working 40 hours per week and using daycare. Presumably she doesn't adjust labor supply further to the policy, but her household can make use of the positive income shock that is coming from cheap daycare, and they can buy more of the household goods and reallocate their time accordingly within the household. I want to see whether the time responses hold also for mothers who are drawn back or drawn into the labor market by cheap daycare, for whom total household time decreases, because if all the action is coming from mothers already working full-time, then the higher educated mothers' bigger response might just come from the fact that they are already working more likely full-time at the base. So it's more like a composition story and less of a time efficiency or preference story. So I think this is really interesting. So I wanted to separate mothers who would be likely to work in the absence of the policy versus who were not. So I don't observe for the same person like pre-policy labor supply. So I had to construct like an index that essentially is the predicted propensity of working in the absence of the policy, which essentially I considered predetermined variables that were not affected by the policy. And I estimated this likelihood on the pre-policy sample, and then for each person I predicted this propensity to work in the absence of the policy. So here are the details how exactly this propensity was predicted, but it's important that it's only predicted by variables that were not affected by the policy. So it is predicted by the interaction of parental education of the mother and the father, full set of fixed effects, linear time trend, mother's and father's age, household size, and so on. So it's estimated in the pre-policy sample and then predicted for the whole sample. And then I interact this predicted propensity with the policy variable. Okay. Again, I interacted with Quebec and the post-policy period, but not with other axes. That just reflects another question that came up. So because I'm interested, like, who is driving the responses. And so for high educated mothers, I find extremely interesting results. So essentially, I graph the predicted or estimated policy impact of cheap daycare, where on the axis, it is the predicted propensity to work in the absence of the policy. So these graphs can be a bit involved, but just on the first graph, just step by step what is happening. So here on the x-axis is the predicted propensity. So these people here, these mothers so they are very unlikely to work if there is no cheap daycare. Okay? And then I graph like what is the policy impact if cheap daycare is introduced. So the fact that I see the highest policy impact for those who are unlikely to work in the absence of the policy. So these are the mothers who really go back or go into the labor market because cheap daycare is available, but otherwise they would be not working. Okay, so these are the high educated mothers. This is only for high educated. So I see that the labor market response is really driven by those who wouldn't be working otherwise. Okay, and then that's interesting. So then how does child time evolve for these mothers? So the interesting thing is that the big child time response, at least within high educated mothers, is really coming from these mothers who would be unlikely to work in the absence of the policy and who are drawn into or drawn back into the labor market by this cheap daycare. And it's also the reading often to the child that is also driven by these mothers. They are the ones who decrease their leisure time the most. But then, so for home production time, it's hard to say anything because the confidence bands are really, really wide. But what is interesting that, so if we look at mental health, so these are the mothers who go back to the labor market or go into cheap daycare helps them to do that. They spend more time with their kid at home, and actually their mental health improves as well. So essentially their negative depression score increases, which means their depression score decreases. So their mental health improves. Their parenting practices seem to improve as well. And for these mothers, again, who have the low propensity, actually the hyperactivity score of the kid decreases. And it's the very similar graph for anxiety and aggression. So while there is a lot of heterogeneity how this policy impacts kids and mothers, to me these results suggest, at least for a subset of mothers, so high educated mothers drawn back to the labor market by the policy, actually for them their mental health improves, the quality of the time they are spending with the kid seems to improve, so they are less hostile. It also holds for like having more positive parenting practices, and this also shows in their child's development. So I think this is really like an area where I would like to understand more what exactly is happening, because for low educated I really don't see this pattern. And I think it's just interesting what is happening there, and I would like to understand this more further. But this again just reiterates that I think this quality of maternal time in the model can be interesting, and I would like to include that in the future. And of course, I'm curious what you think. But essentially, this concludes this talk. So I just want to summarize the findings. What I hope I could provide like a convincing results and model that essentially universal daycare price can be an effective policy instrument to influence parents' time allocation to their kids, and really time focused on the child, including like reading. So I find that as daycare becomes less expensive, parents use more daycare, but they also spend more focused time at home with the kids and drastically decrease their time spent on home production, for instance. And high educated also decrease leisure. And so parents seem to substitute their time away from activities where it is substitutable to market goods, like in home production, and to allocate it to activities where time is complementary to market goods, like child human capital production. And higher educated parents' time responses, like stronger time responses, suggest that they are more efficient in translating time with kids into child human capital, and this leads to widening skill gaps. And again, the separation of time efficiency and preferences is in progress, and I hope I will soon have the results to quantify how much this time efficiency matters to the preference channel as well. So thank you, and we still have 5 minutes for questions, so please, if you have. Yes.
I'm curious to what extent you're worried that the result in the time used, the increase in the time spent with the child, could be driven by a reporting bias. Because if I'm entering the labor market as a mother, I might also be conflicted about that if social pressure is high, and I might more in my mind actually compensate than actually compensate.
Yeah. I totally agree that can be a concern. It is actually a concern if, for the general result of increasing child time, it can be a concern for the differential responses. It is a concern if it's differentially happening for high and low educated parents. So that is something I spent a lot of time looking into the wording of the time use diary, looking into the wording of how time is reported in the census. I think any time when you're working with these data, there are also like other reporting issues which it is a concern. Unfortunately I don't have a way to quantify or like to what extent this might bias results. But I would be very open to suggestions if you have any suggestions how to look into that, because I think that's a really good point.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.